coming. This is sort of an extension of the conversation that's happening in a lot of Chicago homes right now. We have a nice panel of, really all of them are, I would classify as activists. I'm Chris Darka. I unfortunately don't live in Chicago anymore, but when I came here in 1987, that was my first introduction to Chicago. How many of you are Chicagoans? Okay. How many of you went to public schools? Okay. So when I came here in 1987, became to learn about Chicago in 1987. Everyone knows everyone here. It's a small town. It was the end of the Washington era. In fact, when I came back to actually start my job, Harold had just died. But what I learned was the community organizing and the on-the-ground commitment to your community was something I had never seen like I saw in Chicago. And I went on to work at a public foundation that funds community-based organizing in Chicago, the Crossroads Fund. It continues to. Blocks Together is a recipient many years now, I think. Yes. In the early 90s, you guys got a grant from us, right? Yes. Okay. Chicago's a very different place now, right? We still are a city of neighborhoods, but what we're seeing is our neighborhoods are being dismantled. And the first line of attack, as I think Fred will talk more about, were, at least that we knew of, we both came from Los Angeles, were workplaces, factories, neighborhood-based factories like Fickle & Sons, like Stewart Warner, like the Brock Candy Factory. They were based in communities. Fortunately, libraries haven't been under attack in that way in Chicago, but schools are now, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Whose schools are these? What's the purpose of public education historically? How have communities organized to claim their schools? Linda will talk about that. So you don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from these guys. And we're going to start with Cecile Carroll, who's at Blocks Together, which is a community-based organization, multi-issue organizing, and really an interesting group of folks over there. Cecile.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Cecile, and I work at Blocks Together. I've been there for about 5 years. We're a small community organization in West Humboldt Park. Humboldt Park is a big community, but we work west of Pullman, even though our work has impacted the greater Humboldt Park community as well as the city. Our organization has about 4 full-time staff, and the rest of our work has been done by our membership, which is people who either live in West Humboldt Park or go to school in West Humboldt Park, or have children that go to school in West Humboldt Park. We get a lot of work done for being a small organization, and I credit that to the fact that we really believe in membership and building capacity in our members. So our mission is to be an organization that has folks who can go out after they've interacted with us and be in their own movements, whether or not that's in their home or in their schools or in their larger community or on their block. But we're about giving folks technical assistance, and we see organizing in that way. So it's not necessarily you come to my training for 2 weeks and now you're an organizer. It's about building relationships and being there for people, almost like mentors. And doing everything from picking them up to go to a meeting to being there as a shoulder to cry on as this trauma that's been happening in our communities continues to occur, right? So our community has been heavy hit by privatization, by private management companies that come to take over. So we were the first community that had the Academy for Urban School Leadership, which is a private management group, to take over its high school. And with that, we've had about 4 of our elementary schools be taken over by the same management company. The story of privatization and all of the complexities about the market, I'm not that good at talking about it, but what I can say is that when OR was taken over by the Academy of Urban School Leadership, they kicked students out. And we found them, and we made them take them back. And they told us, it's not our fault that we have so many special education students. And we said, well, we told you guys that when you guys decided you were coming over to save us. So we went from a population of about 1,300 students in 2008 to now 635 students. Where did all of our babies go? And it's not that folks left the community. These children were deliberately pushed out of these institutions. And when I have this conversation with some of the higher up elite folks in Chicago, they always look at me like I'm lying. And I'm like, first of all, I'm not a liar. This really happened to us, and it was devastating for our community, and it destabilized us in a serious way. After that interaction happened, we started to think about right now, at that point, the conversation about reform was whatever CPS was saying reform was, right? And it was AUSL, and it was charters, and it was all of this privatization mechanisms. We said, I bet we can start to dig down in the leftover neighborhood schools we have and actually do some real grassroots education reform with them by keeping parents as leaders, by helping folks manage these relationships at these schools, and helping with the trauma that's happening in our community in a holistic and a community-driven way. And we started to do that at Cameron Elementary School. And right now we have a restorative justice program in that elementary school that is volunteered by our parents. We have one full-time staff that's at the school, and we train security guards, teachers, parents, young people for the last 2 years to talk about healing and how to communicate. Because one of the things we found out, because a lot of our children struggle with social emotional support, that they don't even know how to talk about when they're hurt. They don't know really what an apology is. And so we said, well, that's what we need to invest time in. And I guaranteed you, if we can work on supporting social emotional supports in our school, we can have a better school. And we've been working at Cameron for 2 years, and their scores have gone up. That's neither here nor there. More importantly, children love going to school now every day. And suspensions have dropped, and the days out of classroom have dropped. And we have a long way to go, but we've made some changes. The other school that we dug our heels in was Ryerson Elementary School. Even though they were way down the line before, we got there, and I credit that a lot to some parents who really said this is what we're going to do at this school. But Ryerson actually ended up being one of the premier elementary schools on the west side. They've been level 1 for the last 3 years, and actually had and Catalyst actually featured them about 3 years ago. They did single-sex 7th, 8th grade classrooms, and it ended up being such a success. Anyways, they said we're going to be as innovative as possible. So one of the parts of innovation was bringing in resources into these classrooms that were not filled to the brim, right? So Ryerson had about 5 extra classrooms. So they had Target give them a library because they had no library in their school. They had the Chicago Bulls to give them a fitness center. They have 2 rooms that they use for recess because they sell drugs on the corner of Ryerson, and so kids can't go outside every day. And then one of the classrooms is a health clinic that's run by Erie House. So that ingenuity had this school become this premier elementary school. Ryerson's on the list to be closed next month. And because the district says that it's 50% utilized, it's actually 77% utilized. And they want to take 2 schools and put 1 school into Ryerson that would make it at 134% capacity. So we're gonna lose our clinic. They said they're not, but we're not sure how we're supposed to fit those kids without having kids in that clinic. We lose our library, we lose our fitness center, we lose our recess rooms, we lose our science and our art room, and we haven't even talked about what happens with our special education students. So we are going through this trauma, and I want to talk a little bit about the process, because I could talk a lot about how crazy CPS is and how this decision is so backwards, but what I want to talk about is how our organization has to be there to help when our anchored institutions are being attacked. And our libraries and our schools and some of our hospitals are under attack through privatization. So one of the big things that Blocks Together has been known for the last 10 years is we won the West Humboldt Park Library in our community. We had no library in our community since its existence. And it was a 5-year-long battle. Mayor Daley was the mayor at the time and said we just don't have any money. When we finally opened this beautiful library back in July, they named it after him. Oh, that was so frustrating. Like, this is the guy who said we didn't need it. But anyways, so we talk a lot about being supportive in the process around being a community. And a lot of that, and we've been having a lot of conversations, as a lot of mobilization is happening around the city and how we fought a lot to keep some of our schools, even though sometimes we lost them, is about being there for our parents as friends and as looking at each other as family. And that's been on our mind a lot, and I wanted to leave that with you all. We have, when we think about organizing and building institutions and how important anchor institutions are, we forget about the human contact that we need. And we had a really bad battle at Piccolo Elementary School last year that we ended up losing to AUSL. We had invested so much into the parent leadership there, and they were moving in the right direction. And they came and they turned the school around, and we said, not without you guys meeting with us. So we stayed in the building for 22 hours with no food and waited until somebody came and talked to us. But with that, it was so much hurt that was going on because they were building this school to be the place that they wanted their children to go to, and then this came on them. And for a while, we couldn't get work done. Like, people didn't want to come to the meetings, people didn't want to really interact, they were feeling so hopeless. And it wasn't until we said, you know what, why don't we just call all of our parents and say, how are you feeling and what is going on with you right now? And we started having these conversations, and through that, we were able to build back some momentum around that school. And the same thing, I feel, goes with all of our other issues. We think like community organizing is this big bad, oh yeah, you better do it or we're gonna come after you. But sometimes it's about loving each other and remembering that we have a lot of trauma that's happening to us. And that our anchor institutions should be there to support us to either resist trauma or to be able to protect us from trauma, or to be a place where we can go when we are traumatized. If it's a safe space, if it's a space where I know the adults in that building love me and they care for me, and that's how we build movements, for real. We think of them being these huge, in the back basement, cooking up some diabolical scam. I really couldn't do some of the work that we do at Blocks Together without taking the time to do that. And being patient and being humble with folks, and knowing that sometimes we have to be translators. So there's all these complexities that happen around Chicago public schools: tax increment financing, capital improvement budgets, automatic VU money, all of these things. And sometimes we have to translate these complex things into ways that folks can understand it. And it's not always through standard trainings. Learning is ongoing, and so at Blacks Together, we don't have a standard training. We feel like, okay, we have a campaign, we want to win that. Let's find out how we win that. And when we see what we don't know, in order for us to win that, that's when we reach out for training and for support. And again, we use our anchor institutions around us to support us in creating this mentorship and this like hands-on experience. So that folks can actually be able to move beyond this campaign, but then move to the next campaign and move to the next campaign, and know how to ask when they need help for learning and when they need support because they're just feeling really down. So we had a parent yesterday break down on me, and it was like, oh my gosh. And so, but because he broke down, we ended up winning a small victory for this campaign we had. And I was like, oh, I was mad at him for doing that. And I was like, well, we just gotta be real. This is hard for us. We're losing our schools, and we don't have anywhere to go to. And so he just had a moment, so that was okay. And being patient, being humble, and meeting people where they're at is important. So a lot of the parents thought that AUSL was a good idea for our community. And so we said, okay, well, let's start going with them and start asking some questions about what they can offer our children. Do they have any questions to special education? Do they have any questions for this? So we didn't take the approach of, we're gonna go into this space and say, this is wrong for you guys, and that's it. Because the propaganda that's going around privatization of education, I'll just say, is kind of not in our court, right? Last year, if you were from Chicago, AUSL had commercials on the radio. We only have 4 full-time staff. We could never do anything like that. And so we just met folks say, okay, if you think that's a good idea, let's go ask them if they could do this and this and this for you. And the same thing when we're always interacting with folks in the neighborhood, they feel so hopeless, and we just meet them where they're at and say, well, if this is so hopeless, let me just try this one thing and see what happens. They have success, maybe they don't, we debrief and we go move on to the next piece. And we keep moving on and keep moving on until they eventually figure out that this really organizing is about critical thinking, and it's about not believing the man with the suit a little bit, and being able to go with your gut feeling when you feel something is wrong, and being friends to others, because we can't grow a movement without people having some love at the center of the work that we do. And a little bit about our library. It was opened this July after the 5 years it took to eventually come into the community. And the first 2 weeks of the library being built, it had over 20,000 residents come in and out of the doors. And they said that was a record breaker. One of the reasons why is because we have 2 libraries near us, the Legler Library and I think it's called the Humboldt Park Library, but they're on the other side of gang boundaries, which was the reason why we decided this to be an issue for us. And this library is in a particular situation in the community where everyone can get to it that's from this neighborhood and doesn't have to worry about crossing Holman and Pulaski where they're gang boundaries. The reason why we decided to choose that campaign as about the library is because one parent asked this question: I'm sick of seeing all these kids on the street. And this was 7 years ago. And you think, they don't know, what do you mean by that? They're so complex. But as we said, well, let's dig deeper. And we kept having meetings after meetings after meetings about why are children not somewhere else besides on the corner. And then we said, well, we don't have any institutions for them to be at. And at this time, we weren't really deep into our reform work in our schools. That's when we said, well, where are the other places where people can be in other communities? And that's when we said, well, we need a library that's open after school hours and can be a safe zone that has caring adults that are around there. And that's where we made that decision. So we went from a long way to somebody saying in a meeting, why are all these young people out here, to this path of actually identifying an anchor institution that we needed. And then the library wasn't enough. Then we wanted to take back our schools. And then we want to take back our hospitals. And then we want to take back our small businesses and our business community. That's what our long-term goal is. So I might have gone all over the place. I had a very crazy day. Where we are in the movement now, the reform that's going on in the city, the schools that are on this hit list, there are some beautiful schools with some beautiful communities and some families and some people that take care of each other. And we don't hear that story in the press, but I'm in a lot of these schools all the time, and we're actually kind of messing up some things that work. And we look at the scores and we look at this, and yeah, they can use some support in different areas, but some of our schools in the city of Chicago are some great places, and a lot of adults and young people have really built them to be anchors, and we're looking at them as half empty, and we should be looking at them as half full, but the agenda that's pushing education reform is just looking at them half empty. Sometimes I feel like they don't think that we're actually capable of producing good things coming from where we come from. I'm from Inglewood, by the way. So I know that we can do some great things with people, and they're happening in our schools. And just someone either doesn't want us to succeed or doesn't want to actually admit that what they were doing was wrong. It's plain and simple. And they're just going to keep on moving with this train until it eventually crashes. So that's all I have to say. And I'm going to run out for 5 minutes and pick up a daughter, and then I'll come right back.
Glad you're coming back.
Okay.
All right.
My sister was supposed to pick her up for me, and she forgot she's at home taking a nap. I'll be right back, okay?
All right. In introducing Linda Lenz, who's a journalist who's been covering education for a long time, as I'm learning how to say here, I wanted us to think about something too, which is, my work is on agricultural information. It's on the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the 19th century. So what? What are you doing here in a city? Why should you care? Well, the same legislation that established the Department of Agriculture established the land-grant universities, of which this is sort of one. This is an extension of the main one down there. Public institutions of higher education. Higher education as opportunity, not control. And what we're seeing now is a movement to public education, a devaluing of public education, and instrumentalizing higher education, and removing it from the control of the people who actually use it and work in it. So it would be good, I think, to look back on that moral act that established land-grant universities and that period of time in which American libraries were established, public schools were established. It wasn't an idealist sort of moment. It was very controversial, and there were questions around social control, but there's always a way in which the people who are in those institutions transform them. The workers, the students, all of the workers. And this is a moment, I think, where we're seeing Chicago parents and Chicago communities rising up again to claim those schools as important anchors, as Cecile says, in our neighborhoods. So what Linda's going to do is take us back a little bit and then bring us forward to see what the fight for public education in Chicago has looked like over the years.
Thank you. I wanted to make one response to what Camille said, then I'll get back to what you told me to talk about. Because I think about this, she said there are people who don't want us to succeed. I'm sure there are probably some people who don't want us to succeed, but I sense that certainly in the corporate world, there are people who don't think that the public school system can actually teach the kids. And I'm sure they think that some kids in deep disadvantage have such disadvantage that they can't be taught. So that's a little bit of a tweak on whether these are malevolent people or, well, I'll leave it at that. I can't believe that you mentioned Harold Washington. That's how I was going to start, and we didn't even exchange notes. Many people think that the sort of current era of school reform, not counting the 1950s, 60s as civil rights school reform, but the current era started when Mayor Daley got control of the school system, and that is not the case. It started with Harold Washington being elected mayor. He really, first mayor to care about the kids in the city, to not look at the school system as a place for jobs and contracts. But of course, he had a terrible fight, getting anything done in the city at all, let alone move into the school arena. And this is a great story that I could go on and on with, but I'll leave some room for Fred here. So I'll truncate some of the good stuff and say that he was blessed with the city's longest teacher strike. It was 19 days? 17, I should know this. 17 or 19 days, probably 19. And there was, and as Chris said, tremendous community organizing around this and trying to improve the school system. And what that did, it gave him an excuse to move into the school system arena, which politics had pretty much kept him out of, and said, okay, this gives me an opportunity to really do something. And he called a citywide community summit where close to 1,000 people showed up here, actually. I think it was at UIC, and went into breakout sessions of what do we want our schools to be and so on. And he had this sort of small behind the scenes group that included corporate leaders and universities, and I forget who else. And he expanded that and brought in a parent community council, and then tragically he died. I think about where we might have been had he been mayor for longer than he was. It's sort of heartbreaking. And the summit that he created, broad-based summit that included some of the more progressive-minded corporate leaders in town, the head of Amoco, the head of one of the banks, included the teachers union, and included grassroots organizations. They put together basically legislation to decentralize the school system, and that's where local school councils were created. And this wasn't new activism at the time. It's based on a long history of community activism in the city of Chicago. And there were 6 parents, 2 teachers, 2 community members, and the principal. And the teachers and community members had what is arguably the most important decision in a school, and that is to choose the principal. Because yes, we know ultimately you need teachers, but you need a good principal to keep good teachers and move out the bad ones and help the mediocre ones and so on. So created this activism, and I mean the local authority, but test scores didn't rise the way people expected. People just had a misconception about what it would take to improve a school, what it would look like, and so on. And there continued to be labor unrest. There was no strike, but there was a lot of perils of Pauline school openings. And I think one year the negotiations went on into the winter and so on. Yeah, and so there was, particularly in the more elite communities, a lot of dissatisfaction. And then Republicans took over the House and the Senate and the governor's mansion. And in 1995, passed amendments to the Decentralization Act that gave more authority to the mayor. In Chicago, the mayor is always appointed to the school board, but what happened is in the Decentralization Act, there was a really kind of complicated nominating process. I don't think it was a very good nominating process, but it pretty much tied his hands as to who the candidates could be. This mid-course correction in the middle 1990s just took that away and said you have direct authority to, appoint a school board, and they did a bunch of things with the finances and how money gets handled, so that when he put in his team, there was money to create programs, to approve a 4-year contract, the first ever. That was stunning, and to do put programs in the communities. So even though you would expect this city of community organizing to kind of rebel against this, everybody got something. So there wasn't a huge outcry. It happened really fast and everybody got something. The economy was different then. There was money to be used. And I think part of our changed situation is that there isn't money out there. I mean, there are some huge redistributions you could do, but no money that's here like for day or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And so I think one of the problems of how we got here is, beginning in the mid-1990s, you had people in charge of the school system who I think really didn't understand what schools are, that they are living organisms, and you have to treat them that way. And so we went into the age of accountability with Mayor Daley's first CEO, and that was Paul Vallis. There was, schools were put on probation, kids couldn't graduate unless they had, or couldn't move up unless they had certain test scores, completely ignoring reams of evidence that holding kids back does not help the kids who get held back. I mean, maybe it's, kind of boosts some kids over the line, but doesn't help the kids who are really after to help. So that was Paul Vallis. Then we moved into what I'll call an era of professional development, and this is a bit ironic because Arnie Duncan now is, he's known for school turnarounds in charter schools, but the fact of the matter is he had a very good education officer who put a lot, Robert Eason-Aquins, who put together a really good program about teaching mentoring and so on, and professional development. I mean, there was some good stuff that went on there that nobody knows about, but it's really not very sexy. So other media tend not to write about it, but Catalyst is devoted to improving the school system, so we write about it because it's important, whether it's sexy or not. And then Arnie Duncan went to Washington, and he picked Ron Huberman, who had been in the police department, and this guy didn't understand schools, whatsoever. And then we had Rahm Emanuel elected mayor, and he sort of pushed Huberman out. For an interim, brought in Terry Mazzini, who was the head of a major local foundation here, who really did get education. But he didn't understand that, and then Rahm Emanuel went and picked somebody from Rochester, Jean-Claude Brizard, Rochester, New York. He came in and the mayor picked the guy's cabinet. I mean, he didn't even let the superintendent pick his own team. So to some extent, I mean, this era right now is one of miscalculation. We have, the mayor selecting a school superintendent that wasn't really right for the city right now, and giving him his own team, so it's hard for him to lead. We had the mayor, or we had, the mayor not understanding where teachers' mindsets were, having been beat up upon for all these years. And we had this legislation that said, you needed to, in order to call a strike, 70% of your members had to favor it, and the folks who passed that said, oh good, we got them now, they're never going to strike. Well, it was 90% vote, and they went on strike, and I think that just stunned everyone. Frankly, it surprised me too. I was surprised that they got that kind of a turnout. And then the mayor says, we're going to have a longer school day. This is a good idea. Chicago had one of the shortest school days and school years in the country. But again, he sort of mandated it and wanted to add an hour and a half, and then there was this backlash, so he had to skinny back on that. Now the longer school day mainly means there's more time for kids to eat lunch, and there's more recess, and there is recess. Those are good things, but it's not all the extra, music and art and all these things that they talked about. It's like, what else? Oh, and even on, charter schools, one thing is they were envisioned as ways to do one of three things. Good education more cheaply. Well, now we see charter schools are lobbying to get the same amount of money that regular schools get. And some charter schools bring in a ton of private money. So it's not as though they're exactly proving the argument that charter schools can do education more cheaply. Charter schools were supposed to be hotbeds of innovation that would spread. And even Al Shanker, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, thought that was a good idea, way back when he was out there with that idea early on. Well, there may be some innovation, but it's not being spread, and some of the innovation is tied to things that maybe you can't do in regular public schools anyway. And then the other one was, competition was supposed to, of charter schools, was supposed to get the neighborhood schools to do a better job. But what we've seen is charter schools do tend to pull the more arguably motivated kids out of regular schools, which leaves a higher concentration of what you might call harder to teach kids in regular schools. But I mean, if you look at the communities where schools are being closed, you can see that a whole lot of those kids are being educated outside their community. They flee, so you can't ignore that either. So let's see. I think, people are running the schools now. Some of it's ideal, and this is not just in Chicago, but nationwide. Some of it's ideological. They're, free market types, and I think that's how you educate teachers and principals, and that's how you, create better schools. Let's see. Yeah, and I'll go back to the point that I think they don't understand, how schools run. Now, unfortunately, for each of these sort of misguided reforms, you wait until finally, you have the numbers to show that they were a bad idea, and kids suffer through that process. I was at a conference recently where someone put on the screen a quote from Winston Churchill that I think so summed up the school system, and he was actually talking about the whole country, the United States, and I don't remember the precise words, but it was something like, those Americans, they will try everything that's not going to work until they run out of things, and then they'll do the right thing. So I'm hopeful that we're getting closer to the right thing.
Thank you. We're going to have lots of time for questions, so I hope you're writing them down. We're going to have them at the end, I'm sorry, especially now that Cecile's here. So I thought of Fred this morning in the plenary with our guest from CPL, Chicago Public Library, the tech person, who made a point of saying that Chicago Public Library is transforming this idea of STEM to STEAM. And do you know what the A is, Fred?
Let me guess. Art.
Art! Art. And art is essential to education, as essential as science. Fred was an art teacher in grammar school for many years. He has crossed over now and is retired, but he's still very active in
transition.
Transition. He hasn't crossed over in that sense, thankfully. This idea of schools as living organisms, for those of you who are in library school and you think of Ranganathan's 5 laws of libraries, libraries are living organisms. And this is interesting that we're thinking of schools are. These community-based institutions, how do we keep them vibrant and alive in the face of privatization and in the face of essentially the dismantling of our communities? So Fred's going to talk a little bit about his Chicago.
Can we move that?
Sure.
I can't see, it's like I
Yeah.
can't see half the people that are in the room.
Oh.
And I'm a 30-year teacher. I need to look at your faces to make sure you're paying attention. I always tell the kids, I can tell by your eyes whether you're listening. I was a K-5 art teacher for nearly 30 years in Park Ridge, which if you're from the Chicago area, you know is a suburb just northwest of here. I live in the city. I'm a Chicago public school parent. Both my kids are now public school teachers in New York City. And as I was thinking about the discussion that was going on before me, I was thinking about there's a video, you can go look for it, there's a YouTube video, very short, about 12 seconds long, of Rahm Emanuel back when he was in the White House as Obama's chief of staff, where he said, don't let any crisis go wasted. It kind of speaks to the question of whether there's evil at work or whether there's different people trying to get their handle on things. I kind of tend towards the side that there's evil at work, but I was going back and thinking about. Chris mentioned that I grew up in Los Angeles, and I moved to Chicago in 1973, having gone to college for a couple of years in LA and California in the 60s, but you're all too young. But if you know anything about California in the 60s, there were a lot of diversions, and I was diverted by most of them, so I never finished. And when I came to Chicago in '73, this is 40 years ago, this was an industrial city with a unionized workforce. Half of the population of the city was African American. 300,000 African Americans have left the city and left the region in the last 10 to 15 years. I got a job, when I came to Chicago in '73, I got a job at Stewart Warner Corporation. They made automobile gauges. And they were up on Diversey and Damon. Those are condos now. Then I got a job at, I worked on the line making Schwinn bicycles over on Tripp and North Avenue. And that factory, that's gone. They had several thousand workers because they had another plant that made motorcycles. You may not know Schwinn made motorcycles, but they did, and that factory is gone, and the people who work for them, these were union jobs that paid union wages. Then I got a job at Rockola. You got to think of Rockola as maybe as a juke. I don't know if anybody remember jukeboxes, but they made jukeboxes. But they also made vending machines for soda pop. I worked on the soda pop vending machine line. That was over where the Whole Foods is now on North and was it Sedgwick over there? And Sedgwick, right? Yeah.
Sheffield.
Yeah.
And of course, now that's, I'm not sure what that building is, but actually the Rockola plant that I worked in was over on Kedzie and Franklin. And then finally, I got a really all-union job. Then I got a really great job at U.S. Steel in South Chicago, 79th and the Lakefront, 11,000 workers. I worked on the 96-inch plate. Now I had no marketable skills. I could walk into a factory in those days and you could get a job, and it paid well. Insurance for my family. 11,000 workers at U.S. Steel in South Chicago. 20% of all the steel made in America was made between 79th Street on the east side, what they call the east side, and Gary, Indiana. We made 96, I said I worked 96-inch plate mill. That's the steel that was used to make the Sears Tower down the street there. That's my steel up in the Sears Tower. Those jobs are all gone. You drive down down the lakefront to 89th Street, and it's a giant empty lot. So that was the city in 1973, and it's not the city any longer. Those union jobs are gone. The labor that worked in those jobs that were in large part the sons and daughters of African Americans who moved from the South in the 20s, coming north to the city to look for jobs, joined labor unions, had labor unions, and worked here. Those jobs are gone, and those folks are gone in large part. And those neighborhoods that surrounded those factories are either gone or they've been transformed into something else, mainly for, like I said, for Warner, it's $500,000 condominiums. So what does the city look like now? And the schools, in great part, serve the needs of training the kids of industrial workers to become industrial workers. So, for example, I was a millwright apprentice at Southworks. The guy who trained me, Adam Konversky, he was a Polish immigrant came here in 1959, and his kids went to public school, and they had every intention of getting a job in the mill when they graduated. The mill wasn't there when they graduated. So now we have a city that has lost, that's been downsized slightly. Of course, the 300,000 or more African Americans that have left have been replaced in some ways by immigrant, mostly Latino workers, but not to serve an industrial economy, but to serve a service economy for non-union wages, much lower wages without the benefits and so the schools now are in a crisis that Ron is not going to waste, because the question now is the city is changed, it's transformed, it's going to be transformed. There's no stopping the transformation of the city. The question is how does it get transformed? Who's in control of it? And I think what's happening, and I think that this is where maybe Linda and I maybe look at it a little differently, is that I think there is intent on the part of different forces as to how you control the downsizing of the city, and the struggle over the schools, I think, is a part of that. Now, it's interesting. I blog now. I blogged when I taught as well, but I blog more now at fredklonsky.com if you're interested. And about 2 years ago, I got hold of I got sent a videotape, a YouTube videotape of a speech that Jonah Edelman had given at the Aspen Institute, which is a conference held in Aspen, sponsored by some rather rich philanthropies. And Jonah Edelman was the head of a group called Stand for Children, which was started actually as a parent-based community group in Portland, but got basically taken over by corporate interests, and Jonah Edelman spoke and organized on behalf. I had gotten an email from a friend of mine from Colorado who said, prior to this, saying, "Have you heard of Stand for Children?" And I said, "No, they're not in Chicago." And they weren't. They said, "Well, keep your eyes open." And sure enough, 6 months later, Jonah Edelman comes to town, and he drops nearly $1 million on 9 legislative races in the state, and they all win. And days after the election, Michael Madigan, Speaker of the House, Chairman of the Illinois Democratic Party, establishes for the first time a House Educational Reform Committee. And even invites some of the labor, the heads of the IFT and the Illinois Federation of Teachers and my union, the Illinois Education Association, some of the leaders to sit on this committee, and they draft a bill. And this is what you're referring to, Senate Bill 7. Within weeks gets passed, and it does several things. One is it ties teacher performance to student test scores as a basis for tenure and seniority. So tenure in Illinois no longer in fact exists, and seniority for teachers in Illinois no longer exists. And special for Chicago, it's a special gift to the teachers of Chicago. They make a rule that if you're going to go on, well, actually Edelman wanted a no strike clause, he wanted to do away with strikes entirely. But he said, he had done on the tape, it says, we did some research and we discovered that nobody gets more than 75% in favor of a strike in any city. And so if we make a 75% threshold for approval for a strike, it's the same thing as having a no strike clause. And that was the bill passed by a Democratic House, a Democratic Party House, and a Democratic Party controlled state Senate, signed by a Democratic governor, and approved by the Democratic mayor of the city. To essentially do away with really the fundamental rights that teachers need to engage in collective bargaining. I mean, you can claim you're for collective bargaining, but if you take away the strike, the right to strike, that's really the essence of collective. If you don't have the right to strike, you don't have anything. You really don't have the right to collectively bargain, because that's the final tool that you have. And the surprise for John Edelman and for the Democrats in the House was that when that Rahm undid all of that really for them, and that is he was so obnoxious and presented such a challenge that, as Linda pointed out, they not only got 75%, but they got 90% of those voting. The rule was that you had to get over 75% of all the members of your union in order to approve a strike. Rahm, by the way, only got elected by 25% of all the voters in the city of Chicago. But the point being is, I got a 5-minute sign, and I'll be even shorter than that. The issue really is, I think we have to look at the transformation and the struggle over the public school system in the city as to, in terms of who and how we control the transformation of the city from an industrial-based city to a service economy. Those around the Emanuel administration, those in the civic committee, part of the Chicago Federation, their solution is essentially to sell it off and to privatize it. There is no, Linda said that the problem is you have to wait for numbers to come in. But in fact, we've got 10 years of numbers. We have 10 years of numbers. And the numbers show that there's no, as they say at the university here, I graduated from this place, ABD, that the numbers suggest that there's no significant difference.
That's true.
That some charter schools do better, most don't. That the solution, I had to go back to your point about Carroll. I was very active in the Harold Washington campaign. You're exactly right. When Harold Washington was elected, he had mayoral control in a way. I mean, he did appoint the members to the Board of Education. But he made a point of saying, I will not get involved in the decision-making process around the Chicago public schools. This should be the task of parents, teachers through their unions, and the communities that surround those schools. And that was the point of the local school councils. And that is a fundamentally different way of looking at the running of a school system than Rahm Emanuel, who essentially wants to run the public school system through a command system, to centralize it, to remove the parents, to remove parental control, to destroy the teachers' unions, and to remove any kind of community input into the decision making. This will be a question about what our city looks like in 10 years. It will change, but the question is, will it change in the interest of those on the South Street and in the Loop, or will it change with the input and some voice from the teachers and the community that surround the public schools?
So now we want to hear your voices.
I'm from Detroit, and we've had a lot of the same problems as Chicago. We're coming from the same background, factory city. Factories aren't doing too well now. And something that recently came out, I don't know if you know how much Rick Schneider has been advocating for charter schools and for that voucher system of his. But recently, a list came out of the worst performing schools in the Detroit area, and all of them were charter schools. Has there been anything like this? I mean, you did mention that some charter schools do well, some don't. Is there any correlation to that in Chicago? What are the worst performing schools on average there?
Yeah, well, elementary schools, overall test scores, charters are not doing appreciably better. High schools tend to have a higher graduation rate among the high school charters. But, CPS is closing some charters, but it also just approved a new charter from a charter organization where I think they just closed one. This charter organization wasn't doing well enough in this one school, but yet they approved another one.
I could say when we look at charter performance, there's always a shadow about selection of students, and there's also, we have to also consider it's much different playing rules for them. They can, tell a student that is not necessarily performing to their standards to go somewhere else, and that was very real for our community. We have a charter high school, Roe Clark. Roe Clark is a very well-performing school, very competitive, but I've had to help parents navigate where to go once their special education student was told that they had to pay for summer school and the parents didn't have the money for it, or they had a suspension and the school asked if they could just go to a different school, or they were harassed out. I've had all three of those scenarios happen to parents in my community, and we would have to go find an alternative high school for them, or they went to Orr, which is our neighborhood high school that just got turned around. So we always have to be considerate about performance and some of those shadows. I'm not saying all charters do that, but I know for a fact that we've experienced that in our community with more of the prestigious charter schools. So, and this one particular charter high school was proud to do it. It was like, hey, if you can't hack it, then you gotta go.
I got a mixture background. I grew up in the Inglewood community. I guess I was in the charter school for most of my grammar school years. I went to a public high school, all black. I was actually a student for UIC for a while, and then I turned around and went to Chicago. I was part of the Chicago State. So I've been in I've never been to a private school. But my experience, I guess, growing up through the system is that it's all about the teachers that make the difference for your child. And the problem is that, like in our community right now, Marcus Garvey is one of the schools that's been in the news. And in our community fought for that school to even be there in the first place. And what they were going to try to do was get some of the more prestigious families to come into that school, but the community voted no, we want this school in our community, and then they had to actually fight for it to have an African American person to be represented on the building. And so now the school that they're trying to send them to, it crosses gang lines, number one. Number two, the school that they're going to, the kids are already talking about they're going to fight them and all this kind of craziness. The school is not performing better than Marcus Garvey. It's performing worse than Marcus Garvey, but they want the building. So the city wants the building. So even though Marcus Garvey had petitioned to have less kids in the school, so that the teachers can be able to have more control of the environment, And they also have math and science labs and stuff in there to help the kids so that they don't, to try to decrease some of the overcrowding. Because when you have 30 kids per one teacher, that classroom is overcrowded. So now you're going to take a class where they petition to have less so that they can do more for their children, then put them in a school where now it's going to be overcrowded because it's going to be too many people. And then they count on the fact that people transferring their kids to other schools or other private schools and not, putting all their children over into Mount Vernon. So now you have this where people they just don't know what to do. So they have been protesting. It's been in the news, in the media. And the thing about it is that the teachers in the community and the students in the community, they love their school. And they're doing better on their test scores, and they just confused and I don't understand why we have to leave our school when our school is performing better than the school they're trying to transfer us to.
Where's your ultimate on the issue?
I'm not sure.
Carrie
Carrie Austin.
And Marcus Garden?
Carrie Austin.
Yeah,
Carrie Austin.
I may not be right on this, but it seems as though more aldermen are stepping up. Yeah, I don't know about her, but I mean,
She's
more
been,
people.
Solely absent in this
Okay.
whole ordeal. We haven't heard anything from her. So that's another.
Yeah, because some aldermen are going to bat for their schools and are speaking publicly against the mass school closing. What do you know if the city wants the building for a particular purpose?
I don't know the purpose.
Because they have a bunch of schools that they've closed that they haven't been able to sell, and I wonder why they want more schools that they're not able to
I don't
sell.
know, but that's what the community was told, that the city wants the building because it's a good building. So they would rather send the kids over to Mount Vernon instead of maybe the opposite. You know what I mean? But one of the biggest issues are that Marcus Garvey is performing better, and you sending our kids to a work school, and then we got to cross gang lines. So that's a big issue for a lot of parents. It's a big issue for a lot of the children, especially those who have to walk from 99 all the way up to 106.
Yeah. I wanted to say, three small points. First, I really admire some of the progressive aldermen who have been stepping forward and saying something about this. I was down in Springfield with them when they testified with the state legislators. But we always have to be clear, and when we're doing organizing, we're like, yeah, I love to talk to our aldermen. It's really easy to communicate with them. Parents love engaging. But they can't make a decision about these school closures. They have no power when it comes to the Board of Education, right? And so we have to always kind of focus. If we have limited energy, where are we going to focus the power on, right? And at the end of the day, it all falls down on the mayor, right? So we have to be clear about that. And the second thing is, so I was appointed to the Chicago Educational Facilities Task Force back 3 years ago, and I've been sitting there. We helped to pass Senate Bill 630, which required CPS to do a long-term facility plan. That plan's first draft was supposed to be out January 1st, but with the extensions that were made in November when we had this emergency CEO transition, the master facility plan got pushed back to being passed in October, but a draft is supposed to be due this Wednesday. That plan and that movement was around school facilities are very important. How well they're kept communicates and is a part of the learning process, and then how what programs they can offer is critical. Can you have a STEM or STEAM curriculum without a science lab? Which a lot of our schools in our community actually has to figure out, right? And then I love what Ryerson has done, and I actually was with some of the Marcus Garvey parents a couple weeks ago when we told the mayor to walk the walk. I love the fact that a school building could be more than just math and reading and science, but it could be a place where parents learn. It could be a place where other families can learn. There's a discussion around education facilities about we have a growing senior citizen population, and schools could be a great place for this to be some intergenerational learning. We are so missing about this long-term plan that we could be doing with our school facilities to actually be centers for community development, right? We can actually look at the needs in our community and address them through the centers of our schools, which are their facilities. And we're going through a similar situation in West Humboldt Park where the smaller school in the poorer condition, all the kids are going to that one, but the school with the air conditioning and the science equipment and the just recently built and the everything prime or more prime than this other school is going to be left vacant. And so, Linda was asking the question, what are they going to do with these buildings? I think it has a lot to do with figuring out who's going to move into that building as another education institution. And it primarily is going to be privatized educational institutions. They always get the better buildings. They always get top dollar off of the capital improvement. Back in 2009, the district spent 90% of the limited capital dollars we had on charters and AUS sale. 90% of interior renovation funds went to those type of schools. I could think of a lot of schools that needed that money. And these schools were already in good condition. What was that really about?
So just on this facilities question is, take a look at, if you can get, I think you can even Google them. Take a look at the conditions of the UNO schools. These are charter schools. UNO is one of the largest charter operators in the city of Chicago. The scandal now is that they were given a $98 million grant through some greasing of the skids by Speaker Madigan. Now the governor is saying he won't give them the money, but they've already spent half of that money on their school facilities. And you should look at these buildings. These are public school buildings you have never seen the likes of anywhere in the world. Beautiful glass and steel buildings. Money they would never spend on a public school. This is a real estate issue. It's true what Linda says, is that there are already closed schools all over the city that are boarded up and are actually a deficit to the community now, because these are 100-year, these are Chicago schools. They're 100-year-old brick buildings that are now standing empty in the middle of communities. But on the other hand, these charter schools they're gorgeous. And so the question about facilities becomes obvious.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of what you said really resonates because I used to work at U.S. Steel as well, Southworks, and also worked for the CTA as a bus operator, and also worked for Chicago Public Schools. So one of the things about CPS is that everybody knew it all along, that CPS is one of the largest landlords in the city of Chicago. They own all the property. So then that makes the case for them for wanting to shut a school down and give it to developers or whatever. But when I look at what happened at the CTA station that I worked at, which was called North Avenue, it was at the corner of North Avenue and Cicero. And so I used to drive the Pulaski bus, the Cicero bus, the North Avenue, Division, University, all those buses. And so I was trying to get to Oak Park the other night, and I wound up going north on North Avenue, going west on North Avenue. And when I got to the corner of North Avenue and Cicero, I see this big mall there. And I said, so the CTA owned the property, they shut the station down. And when they shut the station down, of course, the property is valuable real estate. So that when you look at those examples of development across the city, you've got public agencies like CTA, Chicago Public Schools, and they own all this property. That's gained for money makers, and then also, as you said, greasing the pockets of developers. But then all of this puts our schools at risk, puts our communities at risk, puts our kids at risk, and it's enough that we need to be out, just like in the period of Harold Washington. We need to be out on the streets. I mean, parents need to be moved to action, because otherwise this stuff is just happening while people are sleeping.
Like me. Or we wake up one day and then what was an airport is. But that was a good decision, actually.
Well, before you ask a question, just about being in the streets. My sense of things, because now that I'm retired, I actually go to more meetings on weeknights than I used to. I don't get up for it. But we had 20,000 parents and community members attending these hearings around the school closings in the city. I haven't seen a movement around a social issue in this city since '83, since the days of the Harold Washington campaign, as there is now around the defense of the public schools. And so I think if Ron was looking for a fight, I think he's got one on his hands. So I'm worried on the one hand about what they're going to do, but on the other hand, I'm encouraged because people are definitely stepping up and they get 20,000 people at these meetings, and Barbara Bird Bennett, the CEO, says that what she heard from those meetings is that people understood why they were closing these schools. I went to those meetings and I got a different. I heard something else.
I was also going to make a comment about just the public schools or other public institutions being viewed as real estate or like fair game for being sold. It's just very short-sighted. It puts everybody at risk. Everybody in the community is at risk in the long run. And I hadn't really considered our schools being community centers for families, not just students. But just a couple weeks ago, a little third grade boy, he came up to me at the library and he was like, "Did you know that you can come on Wednesdays to Morton School of Excellence and you can take a yoga class? Anybody can, after school." I had never heard of that. I have grown up in CPS and I had never heard of a yoga class for the community at a public school. But that just seems like a really good, if we're worried about the use of this space and we're thinking about just selling it off and where we'll never be able to get it back again. I mean, a community center is much needed, so.
I also feel some of that. There's actually a lot of schools, Marcus Garvey, Ryerson, a lot of different schools that are on this list and some that are not, that have, out of survival, turned their schools into community centers because of the lack of other type of institutions that they have. So we don't really have hospitals that service West Humboldt Park, so that's why we have an Erie House Clinic in Ryerson that takes care, and it not only services Ryerson students, it ended up servicing all of the community. Black and Latino families go to the clinic, and I think that's a lot of reason why folks are fighting, because either indirectly or directly, how important that institution is. I mean, a lot of community organizers. If I'm looking for people to know about something, I'm gonna go hang out at a school all day, and I bet you everybody in the neighborhood finds out because everyone's got to come and get their kid at some point, or everyone has an interaction almost with this school building. So it's the way you get the word out. It's where your public meetings are held. It's where you find all these different resources. And like I said, out of survival, we created them as centers of community. And now when we take these, we really dismantle. The last piece of dignity and safety that a lot of communities have. We don't have a lot of our mental health institutions in a time where we're facing trauma on a regular basis. These institutions have been there for families in that way. Now they're not. It's really short-sighted. And actually in California, they've been pretty progressive about this, actually creating joint policies.
Sure.
Yeah, where they bring in a community organization who really wants to get to some kids and really wants to get to some parents, and they're like itching. I see some of the service providers in Humboldt Park like, "Can you come with us so we can go into the school because everybody want to play some kids from our program?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure, come on, let's go." But they really want to be that close with their clientele, and they're willing to help you pay occupancy, and that's what has happened in some scenarios in California. The task force tried to get CPS to adopt a joint policy use standard, and they refused. And I bet you when they come up with their plan next week, there'll be no joint use at all.
I see no hands.
Well, I'm gonna ask you guys a question, actually. to spark some discussion here, but why should we care? How many of us are in library school or working in libraries? How many of us are teachers? How many of us want to be librarians? Okay. So some of the conversation here has been, at the conference, has been, much of it has been focused on libraries and technology in libraries and libraries as community centers. Libraries are all these things, but they're not a substitute for public schools, right? They're very different institutions. And what we're seeing often in these conversations, not here, but we can be persuaded, I think, that we can cut back on public schools in this conversation, in this case, because we have the public library now for that school, for that neighborhood. We're living in a moment where generations of us have grown up only understanding war. Many of us have never known a world at peace, or even our communities at peace, or even the possibilities of peace. We're growing up in a moment where what we call the social safety net is known as entitlements now. That these conversations about the public good are seen as entitlements. And it seems to me that part of what we need to do, for those of us interested in information, public information, access to education, is to think about our roles as citizens, as members of communities, and think about what we want to invest in and what we're willing to pay in consideration of this idea of a public good. And who that money comes from is always influences what the outcomes are. So if the money comes from us, we're investing in our communities. The money comes from Microsoft, they should pay something, they should pay taxes, but they're going to expect something. As we privatize our lives and our social civic world, let's think about the consequences and what we lose in terms of power and the quality of our lives and the opportunities that our children will have. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank these panelists for being here. I hope to see you next year.